Hello, everybody, and welcome to PowerViews Live. We're going to give the audience just another 30 seconds or so to join us, and we'll get started. Hello again, and welcome to PowerViews Live. I have to admit that we have Ardath's voice today and not her picture or video, but we'll see if that gets fixed here in a little bit, but we're going to go on with the show. PowerViews Live is a video webinar series designed to help sales and marketing executives identify and overcome or conquer the critical barriers to success. And as I said, my guest today is Ardath Albee. Ardath is a B2B marketing strategist and the CEO of Marketing Interactions, Inc. She applies over 28 years of experience in business management and marketing to help companies with a complex sale create strategies that use what she calls contagious content platforms to turn prospects into buyers. Ardath's first book, E-Marketing Strategies for the Complex Sale, was published by McGraw-Hill. Her second book, Digital Relevance, Developing Marketing Content and Strategies that Drive Results, will be released in January. Ardath, welcome to PowerViews Live.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry you can't see me.
We're sorry we can't see you too, but thank you for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and get the first slide. Apologize for this. My mouse just disappeared. Okay, there we go. Ardath, at the highest level, your book talks about failures of what you call campaign-in-a-box strategies versus persona-based continuum marketing. And there were two concepts that struck me when I read your book. The first was to look beyond the campaign approach and the one-off unrelated interactions with buyers to a continuum approach that builds a story and positions your company as the perfect expert needed to achieve the desired goal. And the other thing which I thought was great was you don't keep a prospect's attention by trying to sell to them. Can you tell us, why did you decide to write this book, and what do you hope readers take away from it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I decided to write the book because since I'd written the first book and I've been working with companies, I've seen progress, but not as much progress as I would have liked. And there were, of course, some changes with the channels and the different ways we're doing digital marketing. And what I really hear from people these days is, okay, we bought into content marketing. You know, we're creating content, we're doing a lot of this, people are reading it, but nothing's happening. The needle isn't moving. And so generally when I hear this, I go out and I look at their content, and yeah, they create pretty good content. But what I've been lacking seeing is any kind of strategy, you know, any kind of process to orchestrate momentum, to set up for next steps, to really get people to engage and move forward. And a lot of the time it's because we're just not quite relevant enough. We're not really speaking to our prospects and buyers and customers in a way that they could really identify with, in a way that helps them visualize what, you know, the future could look like with the problem solved, you know, all those different kinds of things. And so I started looking at the work I'm doing with specific clients and what we're being able to achieve. And I really wanted to share some of the forward thinking that, you know, I've been working on with my clients, and what I think is the next step, which is really building up our relevance as marketers and being able to anticipate what our buyers want because we know them so well. And that's really what I think is lacking.
Yeah, I have. I made a couple of notes. You know, you talked about in the book the short attention spans, increasing noise, the velocity of content publishing, you know, which really means that you absolutely have to be more relevant to the right audience.
Well, it does, and there's so much for them to choose from. But what I'm seeing lately in the buyer surveys that are going on is that they don't believe vendor content. They think it's biased in favor of the vendor. They aren't seeing enough research and expertise applied to support their premises. You know, vendors are quite often expecting that if they say so, you should believe them. And buyers are becoming really smart. You know, they're self-educating all the time. And so some of the issues that I see that I tried to address in the book were really to figure out what constructs we need to let go because we created them for us. So one of the reasons I'm on this rampage about campaigns is, first of all, they have a start and a stop date. Most of my clients have sales cycles that are 9 months, 18 months, 24 months. So you do a 3-month campaign. For who? Do you know what I mean? It's not going to happen in 3 months when the buy cycle takes longer. You know, there's more people involved. There's more people you have to convince. You can't just focus on the decision maker. Quite often what I'm finding in the projects I work on is the decision maker is actually a bit removed, and they've delegated research and evaluation. Well, if you look at that person charged with the research and evaluation and say, no, that's not my buyer, that's not my decision maker, they don't have enough authority, they don't have the budget, right? We go back to the BAMP thing that you and I have talked about before, right? You're giving up a big opportunity here because they're the ones that are tasked with building the business case and taking it back up to that decision maker and, you know, making the case, excuse me, for which vendor they choose. Well, a campaign that starts and stops doesn't do anybody any good. In fact, it takes, you know, 3 to 5 touches for people to even engage enough with you and say, oh, these people are saying something of value. Well, if your campaign ends and then next month you're on a new theme, you just lost them because you're no longer talking about what they got excited and engaged and curious about, right? So you've changed and you stopped that momentum right in its tracks, and now you've got to start over. Well, it's kind of a self-defeating cycle when you think about it. And it just doesn't make any sense when there's so much that goes on during that buying process and making that decision. You know, so we really need to get out of the campaign mindset. We do it for ourselves because we get bored, right? And then we say, okay, everybody's seen this. Well, no, they haven't. You have. You've been seeing it for 3 months now. You're bored. You want to create something new and fun. Well, so what? Who does that serve, you or the buyer, right? So we have to really, really get our mindset to shift over what is relevant for that buyer, at which stage are they in, what can we help them, you know, figure out, learn about, how can we help them take conversations back to all the people that are involved in the buying process and have those good conversations using our ideas. That's what the continuum is all about, building that conversation, that story over time that helps them make those micro decisions along the way that keep them moving forward.
You have a great interview in the book with a seller eventually getting to the point, it's because it's after the end of the campaign, the only place they have to go with their conversation is to say, do you want a demo or do you want a contract? I feel like the book does a great job of teaching people how to create personas. Could you take us through your recommendations here in terms of, you know, what you and the book suggest?
Yeah, well, over the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, I've created more than 100 personas for clients. And a couple of things I learned was don't decide who your personas are before you do all your interviews and your research, because you'll go after that decision maker, that C-level person, right? And what you may find out during your research is really they're kind of a mini persona. You know, you have to have stuff for them, but really who you need to engage and motivate and create momentum with are other people that are involved in building the business case and making vendor selections and choosing the short list and that kind of thing. And so just be really thorough with your interviews. Talk to salespeople. Salespeople are out there talking to your prospects all the time. You wouldn't believe the amount of marketers I work with who have never had this discussion with sales. And you need to harness that intelligence. And here's the thing that I find so very interesting. For years, we've been talking about this gap between marketing and sales, right? This disagreement kind of thing. Well, when I get involved with a client, and the first thing I do is say, let me talk to all your salespeople. And, you know, I really listen to them and ask them all kinds of questions about, you know, how they're selling, who they're selling to, what their buyers have to say, what words are they using, all those different kinds of things. Salespeople get excited because they think, oh my God, marketing's finally going to give me something relevant. Plus, they want to use them. It helps them think about, you know, what are next steps. And so the thing for me is that a persona is more than just a one-sheet sketch with some, you know, here's the magazines they read or the websites they visit and that kind of stuff. Excuse me. A persona really, it gives you the tools to create an entire content strategy and sales enablement program. And the reason why is because, you know, you not only look for their objectives, but you look at the obstacles at each stage. What is the thing that could make that persona say, okay, I'm done now, I'm moving on to another vendor, or I'm not solving this problem, or whatever the obstacles are. It's not just at the end where they choose to buy or not buy. There's an obstacle all over the place. And So we have to figure out what those are. Orientation is critically important, and it's one of the things that I do is basically live on LinkedIn when I'm doing persona research. What a gift to marketers. It's one place where you can go and you can do a search and find people representative of the prospects you're selling to, and you can read their profiles and find out what they say about themselves, what they say about their jobs, what groups they participate in, and visit the groups and see what kind of conversations are going on. You can, one of the biggest benefits for figuring out orientation, which is kind of the human element, is to look at the recommendations that they receive from other people. And if you start seeing recommendations across a number of profiles that say, they're a great mentor, I learned a lot from them, they really helped me advance my career, and you see that 10, 15, 20 times, right? Then you can figure out that's kind of a common orientation for a lot of these people that are representative of my persona. And so you can look for things like that. It's really a fantastic resource. But here's the thing that I think, there's two things that I think are really key to a persona. And the first one is the questions they need to answer in order to build confidence to make the choice. And so what you do is you figure out what are all the questions that they could come up with. Why should they care? What will happen if they don't do anything? What are their peers doing or competitors doing? Who has the expertise to help them? What are the best practices? There's tons of questions that they need answered. And then you figure out how to answer them with your content. And if you think about the questions, they're not going to ask, what options do I have for solving this problem until they've got the question answered, why should I care, right? So questions are self-organizing. So you can almost put them into a flow across the buying process for how they're going to need to access information as they move along. And the other one that I think is becoming even more and more important is an engagement scenario, given the amount of channels we use. And what I mean by an engagement scenario is, how does your prospect go about researching this? How are you going to attract them, engage them, and get them to traverse steps so that you can get your salespeople in those conversations? What are you going to do? And even better, how could you create engagement scenarios for your salespeople to get in earlier as an expert, providing useful information by sharing your content as well? So engagement scenarios, for example, would mean, okay, if I tweet something with this hashtag and I can attract this persona and they click on the link, then they go to that page, that article, whatever it is, then what? We always have to think next steps. Part of the problem that I see is that a lot of us tweet a link to something and they go there, it's a dead end. Where else do you go? Where's the next piece of the story? If I'm really interested in this topic, what should I be seeing next? So a lot of people, what I call drive-by viewing, they'll click, they'll read, they'll, oh, that's great, and then they move on to the next thing. And it's basically gone, so you've missed your chance, right? When you engage them, you've got to provide them what's the next thing. So finally, the other thing to look at is personas don't operate in vacuums or silos, right? They're on a committee. They talk to each other. So where do they overlap, in the things that they care about? And how can you use that to establish conversations between those people who have similar care about them, who maybe even are in direct opposition, given the impact of solving the problem on the company? So there's a lot that goes into a complex persona. It's not just a sheet that says, here's Sally, the soccer mom, married with 2 kids and a dog, who cares? You need all this other information. Well, unless you're a B2C, sorry. But you need all this other information to figure out, how are you really going to engage this person? What do they really care about? And what might be all the stuff they need to know across the entirety of the buying process, which leads right into that continuum approach.
You also mentioned, I just want to touch on this briefly, you also mentioned that buyers have different preferences for how they learn, which I thought was interesting. There are visual people, audio people, kinesthetic, touch and feel people. Can you talk a little bit about how you work that into continuum marketing?
Yeah, well, actually, a good friend of mine named Rebel Brown has been doing a lot of research over the last couple of years into neuroscience and how it applies to sales. And she's now doing projects applying into sales, and it's really, really interesting. And so she started sharing it with me, and I started looking at it, and I thought, well, this applies to marketing as well. And so, for example, you can do things to learn whether people lean forward, as they say, or view the glass half full, right? Are they looking at the possibility? Or are they leaning away? Are they focused on not wanting to fail, right? So they have to do it. They need to do it, you know, and so they go about it that way. Imagine if you knew the difference between those two things, the way you write your content, the tone and style you use would engage one and not the other, right? So if you can know this, and so I'm looking at it from a progressive profiling aspect as well as from which content they choose to view. So for example, if you're a visual learner, right, and the only thing this prospect ever reads on your website are infographics, they watch videos, you know, things like that. So they read content that uses words like see and view, visual type words, versus somebody who is more of a touchy-feely, you know, and you're using words about, you know, that include feel or touch or, you know, different things. There's a list in my book, and there's lists online you can get for things like that. But if you can figure out which way they lean and what engages them, it's another form of segmentation or another form of being able to approach them. Now, even better, when you pass that information on to the salesperson, and the salesperson's in the room, and they can ask specific questions to determine, are they glass half full, are they negative, you know, in their speech, do they use hearing words or seeing words or whatever all the time? They can actually acclimate their conversation to those things and really engage with that buyer. And it makes a really big difference. And so it's really interesting, the work that's being done.
Yeah. You know, in your new book, moving on to this next slide, and by the way, I meant to mention to the audience earlier, there's a Q&A box. If you have some questions you want to tee up for Ardath or for me, please feel free to do so. But in your new book, you write that buyers want to buy, and they want to do so faster than they do now. And you also write that it's important to create an emotional connection, that buyers want to work with a vendor that not only makes them feel the most comfortable and the best understood, but you want them to say, hey, they really get me. Could you talk a little bit about the steps in this slide and the significance for our viewers?
Yeah, well, first of all, that comes from when I do customer interviews during persona work and development. And, you know, when you ask, why did you choose this vendor? Why did you choose this solution or whatever? 9 times out of 10, the real big decision wasn't made on price. It wasn't made on features. What it was made on about was the feeling they got. You know, they really seem to get us, or we feel like, you know, a big fish in a small pond, or different phrases like that. So it was that emotional connection that they were able to establish with the vendor and the vendor's team. And so when you look at it, we are selling to human beings, you know, even though we're selling business to business quite often. The thing we need to think about is, how do we get an element of emotion or meaning into our marketing? And conversational competence is one way that I've come up to do for doing this. And so remember the questions that I talked about in the buyer persona development. So in this particular slide, you have a buyer who's saying, why should I care about this thing, right? It's a very early stage question, you know, do I need to care about this? Why should I care? And when you can respond to that question with a piece of content that's focused on, you know, because here's the issue going on in the market, and your business is going to flounder if you don't do something about this, right? And so you provided that content, and the buyer says, well, that's pretty interesting, you know, but really, what are my competitors doing about this issue? You know, are people taking action? And you're providing content that's talking about how companies just like theirs are automating processes in order to create scale, right? Or whatever the big whoop to do is with your thing. You know, and they read that and they think, and so you think about this logical process of back and forth. It's kind of a Q&A. It's the way conversations really go. So, for example, you and I are having a conversation. You're asking me questions, and I'm answering them, and then you're asking the next one, and we're weaving this flow together. It's the same thing as that. And as marketers, we need to start thinking about, how do things flow together? What makes sense? What, you know, continues to escalate the relevance that we're creating, which will also elongate the engagements, right, and keep them involved with your ideas versus somebody else's. And so there's a way to construct these flows, which is what I do when I'm creating content strategy or nurture program, that figures out, in in what way does this information flow together that makes sense? So if they read this one piece of information because they had this particular question, now that I've answered it, what would be their next question given what they just read? What do they need to know next? Now, arguably, nobody, well, not nobody, but people don't always go through in a linear fashion, right? So they're going to jump in and out at different times. The thing about this is if you have the whole story and you connect it going backwards and forwards, no matter where they come into it, if it's written correctly to engage that persona, they have the opportunity to go back and learn what they missed or move forward if that's really where they are. So we have to be prepared with the whole story and all the pieces, and we have to figure out how to present it in a way that allows them access to create this conversational rhythm that goes back and forth and helps them learn.
Mm-hmm. You talk about, we agree, we violently agree that sending a contact who completes a form to sales as a lead is a mistake, even if it has been going on for years. And the solution is really this nurturing a lead via the continuum marketing until the lead is actually ready for sales. In your new book, you write the words, downloading does not mean ready to buy, which I loved. You also write that, and you said this earlier, you see great content but not a strategic plan for orchestrating engagement with prospects and customers. And you also talk about moving content from irrelevance to radical relevance. You want to talk a little bit about that section?
Sure. Well, the thing here, and I've been known to say this a lot, is that campaigns just don't work. You're changing themes, and so you're losing people, and there's cutoff dates and whatever, and it's just not fluid. It's not dynamic, and it doesn't allow for any growth or expansion as your markets change, your buyers' needs change, or some new innovation comes out that affects what you do. When you look at the bottom half of the slide, you'll notice these are the questions that I've been talking about and how they can, build momentum over time as people engage with them, because the questions keep moving them forward, right? Keeps moving them forward in the process. The thing about this is, and why it works as a continuum, is new questions will come up for your buyers all the time. They can be inserted into this kind of a process to keep expanding your story and keep relevant by addressing really what are the actual questions buyers are asking today. And you can run this not only from, prospect to buyer, but through your customer life cycle to help customers become advocates. And it can just keep going, and you can keep expanding it and building on it. So versus a campaign where you run the campaign and you're done with the productivity campaign and that content will just languish somewhere, on the website or wherever it's going to be, or maybe never to be seen again, all of the content you're creating for a continuum approach can continuously be used. And so my clients will do versions that are publicly available and versions that are used in the nurture, which is, there's a lot of ways to answer why should I care question. There's tons of different ways to do this stuff and build your stories out. But, you really have to build that momentum. Now, here's the other thing that I want everybody to get. Content alone is not going to tell you when a lead is qualified. So one of the things I wrote a blog post recently about prospect inquiry, which means that if you're creating your content correctly and the answering of the questions, right, and you have that kind of a strategy, you should be able to tell by the content that people are engaging with where they are in their buying process. But you've got to get inside sales involved or field sales, however your system works, in order to find out, are they really where we think they are? Because at this point, it's a best guess, right? And we need that information to keep refining and tweaking to find out is what we think really what's happening. And so, but the key to this is not to have inside sales call and say, I noticed you've downloaded 3 white papers and I give you a demo or whatever. It's to arm them with conversational prompts and information, key points about that content, and to help them establish some kind of conversation that provides value to that prospect, that maybe allows them to offer another piece of content while they're validating where they are. And when I say validating where they are, I don't mean asking them advanced questions. I mean really finding out, are they intent on solving the problem? Is the problem they're trying to solve the one we think it is? Different things like that. So that feedback can help indicate whether they're ready for a sales conversation, but it also can help to refine your marketing program. And when sales and marketing can work together like this, then the sky's the limit, right? We can keep refining and we making sure that what we think we see is what we are really seeing. And we can also find out when stuff is shifting. Like, their inside sales is on a call with somebody who says, well, this was really valid to me last year, but what I'm really looking for is X. Do you guys have that?
Mm-hmm.
Great feedback. And I have a client who's been able to do this and suss out this information from their prospects. Some of them hit reply on the nurture emails and ask for something else, things like that. In fact, we had, I was in a conversation with a client the other day, and somebody who'd been really active in their nurture program as a customer was being promoted. And she was really concerned that 4 or 5 people on her team were no longer going to get the content because she had been sharing it with them. So they all wanted to be signed up into the program because she was moving on, which is a great validation that our content was helpful. And this is in a customer nurture program, so it wasn't really a sale, but there's a possibility now for cross and upsell because she's been promoted, and she's relying on the client as a source of expertise. So you never know where these opportunities are going to come from, but by being responsive, and finding out what they care about and how well your content's working, then you can fill in the gaps, refine it, add more, insert new questions as they arise, and expand the program. It's not a campaign in a box, so it's got that flexibility to allow you to continue to be relevant over time.
And I think what the audience might enjoy seeing is, what's the payoff of this? And this is just a simple example that's based on more than 50,000 dispositions that we create or completed companies we create for our clients every year. In the top box here, the standard lead generation is kind of an example of how you see many companies operate. They have a campaign. They generate a certain number of leads. Those leads are sent out to the field. They may or may not go into a black hole, and then some of those same campaigns are repeated regardless of whether or not they were really truly successful. And then down at the bottom here, the advanced lead generation, I think clients are always amazed when they see that we may have contacted someone a year ago, and at that time it just wasn't the right time for them. And yet we stay in touch with them, and over the period of a year, things change. Ardath, to your point, the situation changes, or they move from agreeing that they have a pain or a need to agreeing to do something about the pain or need, as opposed to, basically not being able to do anything. So you can see at the bottom here that you have not only the sales qualified leads, but your near-term opportunities where it might just be 1 or 2 steps away from being sales ready. You have the longer-term opportunities that you have to stay on top of, which we actually call nurtures. And then you also have an unresponsive group, people that did not respond to a reasonable touch cycle. And in that particular case, they get resegmented, and we stay in front of them with various forms of media over a period of time. Obviously, the ideal deployment is the right person in front of the right prospect at the right time with the exact right information. So this is a payoff that you can see here. Instead of just generating 50 leads, 154 leads are generated by really optimizing all the steps along the process. We do have a couple of questions. We're right at 1:30, but let me just ask one question. This comes from Candace. Ardath, it's always so evident that you know how to sell and you adapt that to marketing. All marketers should, in fact, take note of that. So I guess that wasn't so much of a question as a statement. Let's see here. Where's the best place to start with this type of content? We're launching a program with a client to create a continuum of content, but we can't launch everything at once. Any thoughts about that, Ardath?
Well, I don't know what the everything at once means, but I can give you a variation on that. Quite often I work with clients who ultimately need to have, let's say, 5 personas. What they really have the resources to address right now is 1 or 2. And so we create a general campaign with more high-level content that can engage people. We choose the 1 or 2 personas that we think will give us the biggest bang for our buck, and we implement those programs, and then we weave in the others as we go. So it's iterate, right? Choose what you think you can have the most impact with. It's going to help you reach the business goal that you have set for the program, and do that, and then add in the other things as you go. You're never going to be perfect, and sometimes if we wait until we've got all the pieces and the budget and all the rest of it, we're not doing anything. So the other thing about it, too, is choose to implement the parts that allow you to refine on the fly. So If there's something that is more easily updated, because you won't know how close you are, how right you are until you get it out there. If there's something that you can tweak and refine more easily than something else, start with that, because then you can, make those refinements and gauge success, right, as you weave in other components and you learn from each one and put it together. But it's always iteration. I don't know very many companies, even the big enterprises I work with most of the time, that can, have the resource or the capability of implementing everything at once.
Laura, thank you so much for joining me today. I got a lot out of it, and I've enjoyed the conversation. Ardath's contact information is there in front of you, as well as my contact information. Let me just close out by letting everybody know that on November the 12th, the next PowerViews Live is going to be follow-up or get out of the way, taking the lead on sales. That's going to be with Dave Curlin and Coca Sexton. And then on December the 9th, Outbound is in, which will include Matt Hines and Anthony Iannarino. Ardath, thank you again. I appreciate your time, and thank you, audience, for joining us today. That's all for PowerView Live today.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.